be recorded, and we will make that available in case you need to leave or if you have any other friends that could benefit from today's presentation. Also, there will be a quick 5-minute survey. I think it's 3 questions to help make the user group better for you. So please take the time to fill out that information. As mentioned, if you do need any technical assistance or have questions, use the question box, which you can see at the bottom part of the GoToWebinar control panel. For anyone that is new, we do meet monthly on the 2nd Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern. Following are some of our upcoming presentations. Today we have Kendal Van Dyke, who will be talking about tuning and troubleshooting replication. Next month we'll have Sean McCown talking about minion backup solutions, and in November we'll have Argentis talking about zero downtime upgrades. If you are planning on attending the PASS Summit and have not registered yet, please take advantage of our discount code here so you can save yourself $150. If you have never attended the PASS Summit, I would strongly recommend it, as it is the best place to learn from the best SQL Server presenters. Also, if this is your first time at a virtual chapter, please take notice that there are tons of different virtual chapters covering anything you would want to learn about SQL Server. Also, we have some upcoming SQL Saturdays around the United States and across the world. If anyone will be in Vegas, make sure to meet me. I'll be there myself. Also, on September 17th, there will be more opportunities for you to learn virtually for free. There will be 24 hours of PASS, which is presentations every hour for a whole day. So feel free to register and make sure that you sign up so you can see the sessions that you would like to see. Also, if you would like to volunteer in any shape or form, locally or even on a global scale, go to volunteer.sqlpass.org to find opportunities that match your interests. Also, if there's anyone you would like to nominate for the Passion Award, please feel free to do so. You can do this via email or through the link there below on the community site. So now about our speaker, Kendal. Kendal is a community advocate, public speaker, and a database strategist. He has over 15 years of SQL Server experience and is extremely well known for building high availability planning and implementation sessions, and also debugging and troubleshooting mission-critical SQL Server environments. Kendal is a principal consultant over at Upsearch SQL and a Microsoft MVP. He also does a lot of great things throughout the community, like running the Magic Pass down in Orlando. With that, Kendal, we'll go ahead and make you presenter and turn it over to you.
Cool. And John, the attendees are now coming on in. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, the attendees are coming on in. We hit the start webinar button a little late there, so we'll let everybody come on in and get settled.
Okay. Can you guys want me to go ahead, or do we want to wait just a minute?
Nah, go for it. It looks like most folks are in now.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. For everybody on the East Coast, good morning for those of you who are still on the West Coast and it's still the morning. My name is Kendal Van Dyke. John did a great introduction for me, so I'll spare a lot of the about me stuff. And today we're going to have a conversation, albeit mostly one-sided, me to you, about transactional replication, tuning, and troubleshooting. We've got 3 goals today for our session. We're going to talk about advanced monitoring techniques. We're going to talk about tuning replication performance, and then troubleshooting and fixing some common replication-related problems. Briefly about me, I'm a principal consultant with Upsearch. We're a Microsoft SQL Server practice based out of Cleveland, but I happen to live in Orlando, which means we have 2 things, lots of rain, and yes, there are some crazy people here in Florida. Anyways, I work remotely, so work from my house. It's one of the nice perks of the job. I've been a DBA for over 15 years, and I've been a Microsoft MVP since 2011. And as John mentioned, I run a PASS chapter called Magic Pass here in Orlando. If you happen to be in the Orlando area, either visiting and you want to come by and attend the meetings, then you're more than welcome to. Or if you would like to present at our meetings, we love having new presenters, fresh faces. We meet the third Wednesday of every month at the Disney Vacation Club World Headquarters in Celebration, and we'd love to have you here. I'll also put in a plug for our SQL Saturday in Orlando. It didn't show up on the list of upcoming SQL Saturdays, but it's right at the tail end of all those. October 10th, we're doing it. It's actually in Lake Mary, which is on the north end of town, and we should have 400 plus people, lots of great sponsors, and 50 sessions for you to attend. So if you're in the area, I would love to have you come by, say hello, learn something. It's a great day, as you know, if you've ever been to a SQL Saturday, and if you haven't, you should. Anyways, I'm accessible. You can reach out to me on Twitter, through LinkedIn. I've got a blog. You can run into me at SQL Saturdays. I'll be at the FAST Summit as well this year, and I'm actually giving this presentation. So this is actually an abbreviated presentation of what I'll be talking about at the Summit. I get 90 minutes at the Summit and only about 50 to 55 here. So we'll have to cut a few things out, but if you want to know more and you like the session, come on by and check my session out. So we're going to cover a couple of things today. We'll start off with some mechanics of replication. We'll talk about configuration, then monitoring, tuning, troubleshooting, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So let's talk mechanics. Now, I want to lay the groundwork here for you. I assume that you all have some sort of familiarity with replication. If you have never set up replication before, these terms might be a little bit foreign to you. If you've set up replication, you probably know these already. I'm going to assume that you do, and we're starting at the point of you've set up a transactional replication, publication, and subscription, and you're at least comfortable with it. If you're not, stick around for the presentation. You'll still learn something, but that's just the base expectation that I have for people coming into this presentation. So we won't spend a whole lot of time on the topologies. This should be familiar to everybody. This is central publisher model, one publisher, one distributor. May or may not be the same machine and multiple subscribers. There also happen to be a few other models. There's a central subscriber, in this case a data warehouse usually type of scenario where you have multiple publishers all putting data into a single subscriber. Maybe you're collecting from multiple data centers. And then you've got a scenario called a republishing subscriber where maybe you've got a publisher and a distributor in data center A, and you need to have a bunch of subscribers in data center B, and so you use a subscriber that's sitting over in data center B to republish all of the stuff that's pushed across to from one data center to the next, so that you can save on bandwidth, and also bandwidth is cheap inside of a data center, so it doesn't make sense to replicate the same thing 10 times over to all of your subscribers across the wire. Just replicate it once from one data center to the other, and then republish it within the other data center. Now I mention these because it's critical to understand the roles that each of the servers play, at least at a high level, when you talk about troubleshooting and when you talk about tuning. I already hit on one tuning piece of advice there, which is if you're going across the WAN, just publish it once and then republish it on the other end of the WAN. Looking a little bit deeper, there's two processes I want to focus on with replication, the way that they take place, so that you're familiar with where each part and piece of replication kind of fits. The first is the snapshot process. So when you initially set up a subscription, you're asked if you want to create a snapshot for it. That's how you deliver all of the base set of tables and the data within those tables and other articles out to your subscriber. So in this case, pretty straightforward. You've got your publisher, you've created your publication, your snapshot agent runs. It's actually an out-of-memory process called snapshot.exe. It means it doesn't run within the SQL Server memory space. And it goes and it talks to the distributor to understand what subscribers need snapshots, or what publications rather need snapshots, goes and takes a snapshot of all those publications at the publisher. It's just some schema files and some BCP files, writes them all out to a storage location, usually on the distributor, and then you have a distribution agent which comes along, picks up those snapshot files, and delivers them to the subscriber. Now in this diagram, I've represented the whole snapshot process, or I've represented the parts rather as a separate publisher, separate distributor, and separate subscriber. Your publisher and your distributor can be on the same server, but they, in high volume replication environments, they're not usually on the same server. The reason for that is because this tends to be a fairly I/O intensive process, as you can see by the command delivery process. Once your snapshot's been delivered, now your commands start flowing through your distributor. And your log reader agent, which is another out-of-process executable, goes and reads from the transaction log on the publisher, writes to the distribution database at the distributor, and then you have your distribution agents which come along and read from your distribution database and push them downstream to your subscriber. For every command that gets written to the transaction log, every insert, update, or delete statement that gets written to that transaction log, it is turned into single insert, update, or delete statements in the distribution database. So the reason I show you this, because we're talking about tuning and the mechanics, so you have to understand why replication can explode on you sometimes. Imagine I go and I update 500,000 rows in the publisher. Now, that single update statement is fairly easy to run on the publisher, and it might commit inside of 10 seconds. And you might run the same thing against the subscriber, and it might commit in 10 seconds as well, except that's not how replication works. That update statement that affected 500,000 rows gets written to the distribution database as 500,000 individual update statements, and then the distribution agent has to deliver 500,000 update statements to the subscriber. And when it comes to transactional replication, it honors transaction boundaries, which means if you fail inserting into the subscriber at 499,999 rows, your entire transaction will roll back and you won't get any of it when you are all said and done. And that can be pretty painful, and not a lot of people realize when they set up transactional replication that that's how it's working under the covers. Now, there is a trick that we can use to get around that if you can use stored procedures. I'll show you that here shortly. And then there's also some various cleanup agents that run. They're just SQL agent jobs, and basically they go through the distribution database and they remove all of the old commands that have already been delivered, and they remove some history out of the replication history tables. I show you this diagram, and I mentioned to you that it is an I/O intensive process. So this is why I say in high volume environments you want to have separate publisher, separate distributor, because you're doing writes to your publisher, they write to the transaction log, you're doing reads off of that transaction log, then you're writing to the distribution database, which also is being logged in its transaction log, and then the distribution agent has to come along and read from the distribution database and deliver them to the subscriber, and then write some information back to the distribution database again. So I/O can quickly become a bottleneck, among other things, on transactional replication topologies. Also, a distributor can act as a remote distributor for multiple publishers. So if you've got a dedicated machine that you can handle the I/O on and dedicate it to being a distributor, it might make sense if you have multiple publishers then to go ahead and use one single distributor for all those publishers. That's usually how I've set up most of my replication topologies. It's worked out fairly well for me. I will make one note. You want to make sure if you do that, though, that you set up some sort of a high availability scenario for your distributor. And unfortunately, you can't leverage something like database mirroring for a distributor. You cannot leverage always-on availability groups for a distributor either. Inside the SQL Server box, the only thing that you can do that is officially supported by Microsoft is to set up a clustered instance. Outside of the box, you could do something like use VMware and use vMotion, and then if something happens, you could vMotion to another host. That doesn't always protect you from things like bad DLLs from an operating system patch that goes awry or something like that, but it is some level of protection, at least for your distributor. I would also say make sure that you back up your distribution database on a regular basis and treat your distribution database and your distributor like it is a user database. You'll notice, and I'll show you in Management Studio here in a minute, it actually is listed under system databases, but there's all kinds of things that can go wrong with just whistling by the graveyard on that one and letting SQL Server handle it, that you can tune and you can tweak to make your life a little bit easier. So speaking of which, let's talk about some of the knobs that you can tune and some of the things that you can configure with replication. Now, most people think the only thing that you can replicate are tables, and that's true, you can replicate tables, but you can replicate a lot more in transactional replication, including stored procedures, UDFs, views, index views, and also some DDL commands. Basically, most things that are an alter table statement can be replicated. Now, I want to focus on that second bullet point, which is the stored procedures. Usually, by default, you will replicate just the definition of a stored procedure. Now remember a few minutes ago when I said an update statement gets turned into an update statement that affects 500,000 rows gets turned into 500,000 update statements? Well, if you can wrap that update statement within a stored procedure and all of the tables and base objects and everything else that stored procedure depends on to work are part of your publication that you have set up, you can actually replicate the execution of that stored procedure as well. And then your single update statement that fires up the publisher gets written to the distribution database as a stored procedure call, which handles the update, and then delivered downstream to your subscriber as a stored procedure call that all of the logic within that stored procedure then gets executed. So you could cut down on a lot of that chattiness with replication if you can wrap your update statements and your delete statements in particular inside of stored procedures. Obviously, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for an insert statement. Usually you're inserting a single row at a time anyways, but if you're doing something like inserting from the contents of another table, for example, maybe you can wrap that logic inside of a stored procedure and replicate that. So that's a nice little trick that you can replicate the execution of a stored procedure. I actually want to flip over to Management Studio now and show you a publication that I've got set up already. And I'll show you where you can change that. One of the neat things about replication that I've found over the years that I've worked with it, and Management Studio in general, is I often get caught in doing the same things over and over again. I kind of right-click in the same places, and I choose the same menu options. And I'm constantly surprised over the years that there's always some menu option somewhere that I didn't know about. And there's always something that I'm like, wow, I wish I'd known that 5 years ago. It turns out there's a lot of that with replication. So most of what you do with transactional replication is wizard-based. Once you've got it set up, a lot of people don't really think to go back and look at properties of publications and look at things. And also, when you're setting up a publication to begin with, there's a lot of extra buttons that you can click on that most people overlook. They just accept the defaults. So let me show you a publication that I've got set up already. This is just the AdventureWorks 2012 database. And I'm going to look at the properties for this publication and check out on the articles. You notice I've got some tables here that I've selected, but I've also got a stored procedure, a couple of stored procedures that I've got selected to be a part of this publication. See this button in the upper right corner here, this article properties? You can drop this down and you can set the properties of all table articles if you want, or of just one individual table article. And you can do the same for stored procedures. You can also right-click and choose set the properties of all the articles. So let's check out the properties of stored procedures, for example. And notice that I've got an option here to replicate to the destination the stored procedure definition only. And I can click the drop-down and I can choose the execution of the stored procedure. Or I can also choose it as a serialized transaction if I want. But this is what you would want to change if you want to execute the stored procedure to downstream to the subscriber. So you'll replicate both the DDL for it and you'll replicate the execution of that stored procedure as well. Now, there's not a lot of options that you can change with stored procedures. That's the most important one. But let's take a look at tables for a minute, because there are a lot of things that you can tweak about tables when you deliver them to subscribers that you might not be aware of. So if you look at the properties of a table article, you'll notice there is a lot of stuff that you can change about how that table gets delivered to a subscriber. So you can choose foreign key constraints or clustered indexes or non-clustered indexes. In fact, non-clustered indexes is by default false. I changed this to true. So non-clustered indexes are not delivered downstream to subscribers by default. You may want to have, there may be a good reason. You may want to have a separate set of indexes rather for your subscribers. But know that this is one of the options that is available, is you can include all of your non-clustered indexes alongside your clustered index when you deliver that table to the subscriber. And there's a ton of other options in here. I'm not going to go over every single one. The point here is to let you know that there are properties for tables, for stored procedures, that you can change so that you can tweak exactly what that looks like downstream at the subscriber. I'm going to cancel out of this, I will make one other point here, which is you can do both vertical and horizontal filtering on tables. If you don't want particular columns out of a table, for example, and you expand that table name, you can remove a couple of columns, and that will create a vertical filter for you. Horizontal filtering would be a where clause. So if you only wanted to include certain rows from this particular table, you could do that as well. But be aware that when you filter a table, whether it's horizontal or vertical, the log reader agent still has to do all of the work of looking through the log and evaluating whether there are rows that were modified in a transaction log that need to be delivered downstream to the subscriber. So you might think to yourself, you might be tempted to think, I don't need these two columns in here for this table, and I update them 50 million times a day, but they don't live on the subscriber, so I'm going to save a lot of work. And while that may be true, you're not delivering update statements if that's the only thing that changes about that table. You might not be delivering those update statements to your subscriber, but the log reader agent still has to do all that work. It doesn't just automatically skip over anything in there. It still has to evaluate whether or not those columns or whether or not the changes to that table included the columns that are replicated. And also a word of warning on horizontal filtering. I don't have anything filtered here, but I could. This is, let's say I wanted to filter on name and put a where clause in here, basically, where name begins with N or something like that. I could do something silly like that, but the point behind me telling you this is that there is no active process sitting there on the subscriber that evaluates this where clause and automatically removes rows from the subscriber that don't meet this clause. So what you want to have in your where clause is a column that is actively changed, because the log reader agent isn't going to, well, let me give you an example. Let's say you wanted to filter on date, and you just wanted to include only the rows that were older or that were newer than 90 days. And anything older than 90 days you don't want downstream at your subscriber. So you could filter on a date time column and put criteria in there for anything newer than 90 days. The only problem with that is if nothing changes that row, the log reader agent is not coming along and looking at the contents of the table and seeing which rows meet that criteria. It's only looking at the transaction log. So unless something is actively changing the rows in that table, your criteria is not going to be met. Nothing's going to evaluate it, and those rows will sit around on the subscriber. So make sure if you're adding horizontal filtering to a table that you're doing it on something that is an active column, something that's actively changing, that the log reader agent would actually see in the transaction log and then deliver the commands downstream to the subscriber. Okay, let's go back to the presentation.
Hey, Kendal, we do have a good question.
Yes.
Okay. The question is, what benefits are there for replicating the execution for a stored procedure? And do you have a simple use case for that?
Sure. So the one main benefit of replicating the execution of a stored procedure is that that scenario where I said you update 500,000 rows, or you update some large number of rows in an update statement, for example. However many rows you actually updated by that update statement, if you just had it inside of an update statement, begin tran, update, rows, commit, that gets turned into 500,000 individual update statements that are inserted into the distribution database and then delivered downstream to the subscriber. Whereas if you were to wrap that update statement inside of a stored procedure and you replicated the execution of a stored procedure, then when you called that stored procedure, the same work would be done, but only the execution of the stored procedure would be put into the distribution database, and then the stored procedure would be executed downstream at the subscriber. So you're saving yourself a lot of extra I/O, for example, at the distribution database of having to insert 500,000 rows, having to read them, having to delete them later on when they've all been delivered, and having to deliver 500,000 individual update statements to a subscriber.
Awesome.
So if you can wrap large volumes of changes to rows inside of a stored procedure, you're going to get that benefit. You can also take advantage of the fact that you're delivering the the command as a stored procedure at the subscriber. So all the benefits that you get out of a set-based statements and stored procedures would apply there as well. So SQL Server can use optimal execution plans and all that kind of good stuff that comes along with stored procedure execution.
Excellent. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, one other quick tip around index views. You can replicate an index view if you want to. Normally, it only gets replicated as its definition. There is a trick that you can apply to replication to replicate an index view as a table. So let me go back to the demos here, and I've actually got a replication. Here we go. I want to show you what this looks like. So an index view, remember, is basically a view that you would create that you would then go and stick an index on top of. So SQL Server basically materializes that view. I actually don't think I set one up in here as part of this publications, but I do want to show you where you can do it. Yeah, I don't have an index view in there. Oh, I do. Look at that. Okay, sweet. If you select index views, normally what's going to end up happening here is the DDL for the index view is just what's going to be replicated. That's it. So that means that all of your base tables need to exist at the subscriber for that index view to basically be evaluated and materialized at the subscriber. If you and there's no way to select in your article properties, for example, that you want to replicate this as a materialized table. But imagine the benefit that you could have. Let's say you want to have at a subscriber, you want to have 50 subscribers. You're serving some web app for Black Friday, and you just need to scale out, and you want to have this one table that's already been materialized, or this index view that's been materialized as a table on all 50 of those subscribers, but you don't want to do the work of actually evaluating that indexed view every single time at the subscriber. You just want it to look like it's a table at the subscriber. You could, back at the publisher, create it as an index view, include it in your publication, and with this one simple trick, you can actually replicate it as a materialized view. So what you'll see is there's no option for it in the UI. So let's back out of this, and I want to show you where we have it. Here we go. So this index view, let me bump this up so you can see it a little bit better too. So by default, if you were to script out your publication, what you would see is SP add article getting called, similar to this first set of statements. So let me comment out the second set too. And you'll see that the type parameter is index view schema only. You can change this. And if you changed it to index view log based and then execute your script to add your article to your publication, you can actually replicate that index view as a materialized table, and then you don't need the base tables that it relies on under the covers to be replicated. You don't need the view DDL to actually be replicated. This actually gets replicated as a table downstream at the subscribers. So that's a pretty cool little trick if you work with index views much and you need to replicate those out. Okay. Publications, I hit on article properties already. We talked about filters. Schema changes do get replicated. I mentioned that. Mostly it's alter table statements that get replicated. You can turn those off if you want to. It's in Management Studio. So if you really need to, you can look at the publisher, you can look at the properties for a publication again, and then you can look at subscription options. This is another one of those options I told you about that if you just never clicked on it, you'd never know that most of this stuff is here. But notice in here that you've got an option for replicating schema changes. And by default, it's true. You can turn this off if you want to. And that would allow you, if you really needed to, like do some work, for example, back at the publisher, and not have schema changes get replicated downstream to your subscribers. So I've used this every now and then where I've needed to like expand the length of a column, and rather than replicating it as an alter table statement, I would turn off schema changes. I would apply the alter table statement to my publisher and then apply it to my subscriber, and it didn't cause any issues with transactions and slowing things down. I would stop the distribution agent, of course, so that there weren't any problems. But know that you can stop replicating schema changes for tables if you really want to. That's another option that's available to you, another knob that you can tweak and tune. Synchronization mode, I'm actually going to skip over this one for the sake of time because I want to get to the troubleshooting demos. There's a couple different ways you can synchronize publications. The default is automatic, but we'll skip over that one. I'll tell you, come to my session at the summit or go look at this on Books Online. The Books Online is just wonderful, great nighttime reading when you want to put yourself to sleep, reading everything that there is to know about replication. Recovery model, I mentioned this because a lot of times people don't realize that you don't have to be tied to a specific recovery model at your publisher in order to use transactional replication. And in fact, a lot of times this trips people up. They think you've got to be in full or bulk logged, and you don't. You can be in the simple recovery model in a transactional replication topology. Where this does cause problems for people is they see simple recovery model, but then they see the transaction log is growing, and they don't understand why. And they may not realize that there is a publication, a replication publication, that has transactions in the transaction log. So what happens when you're in the simple recovery model is the log is not truncated after transactions complete like you would expect. They're actually kept in the transaction log, and we keep writing to the tail end of the transaction log until the log reader agent has had the chance to come along and read through all the transactions in the log and then mark the log for reuse. And so if you ever get caught in a scenario where your transaction log, you're in the simple recovery model and it's growing and growing and you don't know why, go look in the log reuse weight description column in sys.databases, and I bet you $10 says that it's because there's something replication related going on there. Okay. All right. Subscriptions, let's talk the other side here on the subscription end of things. There are two types. There's a push model and a pull model for subscriptions. This basically refers to where the distribution agent runs. Push means it runs on the distributor. Pull means it runs on the subscriber. 99% of the time I've ever worked with replication, we've been in the push model. Why would you want to be in the pull model? Well, maybe you have a distributor that is heavily taxed and you don't want to run a ton of those little out-of-process executables on your distributor, so you'd rather distribute the workload and run them on your subscriber. There also is a neat little option with pool subscriptions where you can grab your snapshot from an FTP server. So you could, on your distributor, set up your snapshots to be delivered to a folder where you've got an FTP site configured to give access to that folder. And in the pool subscription model, your distribution agents can be configured to grab those snapshots from FTP instead. So normally what happens in that snapshot delivery process is, recall earlier in the diagram I said your snapshot files are usually written to a file share that lives on the distributor. Well, imagine if you've got a really big snapshot, like 20 gigs or 30 gigs inside the data center. That's not a problem. That is bandwidth is cheap inside of a data center. But if you're going across a WAN, for example, trying to pull a 20 gigs worth of snapshot files could take you a whole afternoon, could make your day kind of miserable. So you can set up FTP, for example, to with pool subscriptions to go and pull the snapshots over FTP first, copy them locally, and then apply them from your subscriber to the local host, which is a heck of a lot faster to do something like that. I said I wasn't going to touch on synchronization types. I kind of lied. There's a few synchronization types in here. Go look them up in Books Online. The default is automatic. That means basically if you touch your publication, you add an article to it through the GUI, you run the snapshot agent, you're going to snapshot everything. If you want to get really fancy, you can do initialization from backup. That's what that sync type of initialize with backup is. Outside of the scope of this presentation, but if you come to my summit session, I'll try to show it off there too, okay? But you can also initialize publications or synchronize publications from a backup file if you've got that available. So another way that you can cut down on the amount of data that you have to transfer across the wire for those scenarios where you've got a subscriber across a WAN, for example. Okay, there is an option called Sync with Backup, and not a lot of people know about this option, but in a disaster recovery scenario, this is a great thing to know about for replication. Whether you use it or not, just know that it's available. So there's This is kind of confusing because there's two places that you can apply it. The first is your distribution database, and the second is your publication database. And what it means is different depending on where you apply it. So on your distribution database, if you enable sync with backup, it means that transactions that are in the publication database's transaction log are not going to be truncated for any reason until they actually get backed up at the distributor. So it's not even good enough then that they're read by the log reader agent, it's that they're actually backed up at the distributor. So this is a way to ensure that you don't have data loss, because if you were to lose your distributor and you're taking backups of your distributor and you restore that distribution database, you restore your distributor, and you need to pick back up where you left off without resynchronizing everything, then you want to make sure that the transactions are available on the publication database and that everything is synchronized exactly to the same point. So you'd want to turn this option on. In that case, Microsoft recommends it. It doesn't have any impact on replication latency. It does mean that your distribution database or your publication database transaction log files might get a little bit bigger than you're used to. If you're in the full recovery model or bulk log, this makes sense. Not so much in the simple recovery model. Okay. At the publication database, on the other hand, if you apply this, it means that the transactions that are in the log of the publication database don't even get delivered to the distributor until they're backed up at the publisher. So this does have an impact on replication latency. Imagine that you're backing up your transaction logs every 15 minutes, and you take a backup, and then you start making changes. Well, those changes won't be delivered until your next backup takes place 15 minutes later. So now all of a sudden, you've got latency issues. So if you can tolerate latency in your application, turn this one on. But if you can't, go and at least do sync with backup back at the distribution database. This is really simple to check if it's on. You just select the database property EX value for is sync with backup. The first parameter is the name of your distribution database or your publication database, as the case may be. And then SP replication DB option allows you to change sync with backup. You don't have to stop any agents. You don't have to restart anything. It takes effect immediately. Okay, monitoring. You probably all know and love Replication Monitor. This is pretty straightforward. So I'm actually going to skip through, well, I'm just going to jump to the demo, actually, because this is a lot more fun when I show it to you live. All right, so Replication Monitor is not the best tool, but it's the best thing you've got for a GUI anyways for monitoring replication. And of course in Replication Monitor you can take a look at what's going on across all of your publishers and see all of your subscriptions and all of your agents and see the status of everything. And a lot of people don't realize too that you can double click when you get down to looking at an individual subscriptions within a publication. You can double click on your agent and you can actually see some pretty detailed information, and you can see the logs of what's going on, the publisher to distributor logs, your distributor to subscriber logs, and then be very careful clicking on the undistributed commands tab, because if you've made a ton of changes, this is actually looking through the history tables in the distribution database, and it might take a while to return. If you've got a really large volume, high volume, large amounts of data topology that get replicated, this might take a little while to return. In this case, this is a demo. Everything is running on one VM, so this is pretty quick to return. But of course, the important thing that you care about here is your distributor's subscriber history when you're looking at your distribution agents. And so you can see what's going on in here. Obviously, I applied a snapshot, so you can see that I've applied a bunch of scripts. I've done some bulk copy, and now my agent is running. I can start it with the action menu here. I can stop it. I can reinitialize it if I want to. Lots of great things I can do inside of here. Tracer tokens, I'd like to point out. If you're not familiar with these, they're kind of neat, but they're kind of useless. Tracer tokens basically allow you to measure latency from your publisher all the way through to your distributor. And if you insert a tracer token, it basically writes a row to the transaction log at your publisher that gets a special row. It gets picked up by your log reader agents, and it writes some information into your tracer token related tables into the distributor. And then the distribution agent also goes and picks this up and finishes out that history so that you can actually see from end to end what your total latency is. Now, this is great if things are healthy, but when things are behind and somebody knocks on your door and says, hey, is replication slow today? Then your first inclination might be, hey, let's go stick a tracer token in there and see what the problem is. Well, if replication's behind, and let's say your log reader agent is an hour behind for some reason because you had tons of changes that were taking place and the log reader agent can't keep up, you'd go insert this tracer token and then you'd wait an hour to find out that your log reader agent was behind. So that's kind of useless at that point because you know replication is behind. At best, you're going to insert a tracer token and you're going to see that it makes it to your distributor, and then you might see that your distributor's subscriber stays blank, never gets updated, and then you know, okay, well, my problem is not on the log reader agent side of things, my problem's on the distribution agent side of things. Really, this is only helpful if things are good, or if you had the foresight to set up a job, and I've seen people do this before, set up a SQL agent job that would go every minute and just insert a tracer token for every publication. Sure, that's a strategy that would work if you want to measure latency and know exactly when problems began. So tracer tokens are sort of useful. Okay. Same thing goes with your snapshot agent, your log reader agents. You can double-click them. You can see history behind them, and you can stop them and start them. This is basically a front end for all the jobs that are in SQL Server Agent. If you actually go look at your publisher and your distributor, you can see there's some replication-related jobs here that have some funny names to them. It's all they're doing is basically tweaking all the parameters that are in these jobs, all the options that are passed into start jobs and the frequencies and everything else. It's just wrapping it with a nice front end. So it allows you to see a bunch of stuff in one place, but really behind the scenes, these are just jobs that are getting called, SQL agent jobs that are getting called. And let's take a look now over at warnings. Now, when you have a problem with replication, and notice I said when, because chances are when you work with replication, you will have a problem with replication. It will break. You want to know about it. The last thing you want as a DBA is to have somebody knock on your door and say, hey, is something wrong with replication? And then you go discover something's wrong with replication and you got some egg on your face. So it would be wise of you to set up alerts for replication. So if, for example, a distribution agent fails because it can't apply a command to a subscriber, you would get an alert about this. There just happens to be some pretty nice alerts for stuff like this. You can go over to your warnings tab, click configure alerts, and you've got a pretty cool list here. I kind of laugh every time I see this because there are still some alerts that are holdovers from dial-up days. Notice you can do slow merge over a dial-up connection. Kind of fun. I guess if you've got agents out in the field who are using dial-up to do merge replication, that would make sense. In any case, the things that you care about for a transactional publication would be, the things I care about usually anyways, are agent failure and perhaps agent retry. Okay? And in either case, what you want to do is you want to choose your alert and click the configure button. And this is a pretty familiar interface. All this really is, if you look over in Management Studio, are just alerts for SQL agent jobs. So you can configure the error numbers if you want. You can change. You can add some error numbers, but these are pre-configured for you. And you can configure what you want it to do. Normally, it would be notify an operator by email. So you would want to do something like new operator. I don't have actually. I don't have mail set up on here. Let me go back to that. Say, hang on. Oh, I just cancel the whole UI. Replication Monitor is an awesome tool sometimes. Oops. Hang on. Let me get back to Management Studio. And let's go back to the alerts. Because there was one thing in particular I wanted to show you, and that is, actually two, I lied. On your Options tab, change your delay between responses. Change it to something like 5 minutes, because the last thing that you want to have happen is set it to 1 minute, and then an agent fails at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you wake up to a few thousand emails. That's never fun. So change your delay between responses to a few minutes. And then the other thing that I want to make sure you know is by default, these are not enabled. So make sure you check the enable box. I have had people tell me, I configured replication alerts, made a test, nothing worked. Can you tell me why? That's the first place I look, and it's usually because it's not enabled. So make sure it's enabled. Very simple. Okay, that is Replication Monitor in a nutshell. Let's take a quick look back. We covered tracer tokens, we covered alerts. Replication Monitor is a nice tool, but if you really want to dig under the covers, there's a bunch of stored procedures that you can call, system stored procedures, back at the distribution database, some at the publisher as well. Now, I know Microsoft's take is don't call system stored procedures. Officially, it's not supported. Don't query the tables that are underlying because they're not officially supported. But the reality is not a whole lot's changed with replication and the system tables since 2005 or 2000 for that matter. A lot of these are similar. So I'd go with Microsoft's advice. It's not officially supported, but chances are it'll work. So you can run SP help publication, SP help article, SP repl counters. These are the exact same things, by the way, that Replication Monitor is running. If you load up a profiler session or you load up an extended event session and you look for the stored procedure calls by Replication Monitor, these are what you'll find. So you can run all of these, run any of them. I'm not going to dig into them in the interest of time, but know that they are there and you can look at them yourself. They give you all kinds of really interesting and useful information about your publications and your subscriptions. There are also some perfmon counters that you can take a look at. I don't really keep an eye on perfmon a whole lot with replication, to be honest with you, because it's very spiky. What you'll find is a 5-second period where commands are being delivered, and so you've got some values for your distribution agent perfmon counters, and if you happen to catch it at the right time and constantly be monitoring, you'll catch the value that for things like how many commands are being delivered at any given time. But chances are you won't because you're only monitoring every 10 or 15 seconds, and so you'll just look like 0, 0, 0 across the board. So be careful with perfmon counters. They're not my favorite for monitoring replication performance. You can look at some of the tables in the distribution database. There's some awfully interesting things in there too. I've got a couple of queries, so I'll save you some time if you want to see how all these guys work together. I will make sure somehow we'll get them uploaded to the website, or I'll put them up on my blog. There's some queries that allow you to go basically and interrogate the distribution agent history table and the log reader history tables, and you can build a history for, or you can build get an idea rather of what your latency looks like at any given time. How many commands have been delivered? How many commands are delivered per day on average? How many delivered per hour on average? You can do this by publication, so you could figure out which publication is the one that is generating all kinds of noise and which publications are being backed up by this one that's replicating a ton of commands. So I'll get you these queries. These basically look at the underlying tables and give you some useful information. So what you care about, what I want you to know is tweak your distribution agent history if you can. So if you, at your distributor, you want to right-click on the replication option in the tree view for Object Explorer and look at the properties for your distributor, and you'll notice you've got history retention here of 48 hours by default. If you can afford to, bump this up to something higher, because the longer you can retain your history, the more accurate metrics that you'll have on number of commands that were actually delivered when you run these queries that I just mentioned. So you'll have better metrics around per publication, per article, how many commands are being delivered to the distribution database by the log reader agent, and how many are being delivered by the distribution agents down to each subscriber. All right, that was the important piece I wanted to make sure you knew about. Let's go back to the presentation. We talked about tuning some things. Agents, distribution agents, or replication agents rather, or some other places that you can tweak. Back in Replication Monitor, you can right-click on an agent. Let's pick the snapshot agent, and you'll notice that there's this option for agent profile. And in the agent profile, there are a couple of agents. The default agent, like most things in replication, the default's pretty good. you can change your profile to run as something different if you want to, or you can change the values for your default agent profile. These values allow you to tune certain things like how many rows are you BCPing into your distribution database by your log reader agent, or by how many rows are you BCPing into your tables at your subscriber by your distribution agent. How long do you wait until you time out for your queries? How long do you wait until you time out for your logins, for example? There's a lot of things that you can tune with this. There's only one default profile for Snapshot Agent, but distribution agents actually have quite a few profiles. So you'll notice one up here is continue on data consistency errors. I want to point this one out in particular. You'll notice that this skip errors command here has a few error numbers in this. If you happen to run into any errors delivering commands to a subscriber that have these numbers in them, then if you have this profile selected, then the distribution agent will just skip right over them. Of course, that might mean you have some data consistency problems at your subscriber, but it would also mean that you don't get those thousands of email messages throughout the course of the night. So take this one with a grain of salt, but the point here is for you to realize you can change a lot of options around your distribution agents and log reader agents using agent profiles. All of these parameters and what they do are very well documented in books online. So you can go look them up and tweak them if you need to for your environment. You're not just stuck with the set of defaults that Microsoft says this is all you get and that's it. Now, let's go back to the presentation. All right, subscription streams is an interesting feature that was added. So in 2008, I believe it was. But you're probably all on something newer anyways, since support for 2008's expired at this point anyways. But what subscription streams allows you to do is, in essence, multi-threading for distribution agents. You can apply this to your distribution agents, and rather than, let's say you modify 3 different tables inside of a transaction. Well, under normal circumstances, you would apply the change to the first table and then apply the change to the second table. The distribution agent would. It would apply the change to the first table and then the second table and then the third table in the order that they happen. But if you have subscription streams enabled, you can bump this up and actually basically multi-thread so that the distribution agent would go and apply the changes to all 3 tables at the same time. This is really easy to change. You just look at your properties for your distribution agent, and this, or the job actually is this. If you look at the, let's go back and take a quick look. I'll show you. This is a distribution agent, for example. So if I look at the properties on this guy and I look at the steps, and step number 2 is run agent, I can modify this step. I can also do this, by the way, through an agent profile if I really want to. Notice that those values that you saw in agent profile are present here in the job step. So this is kind of a signal to you that this is all this is doing is just calling an executable, and the agent profile is just applying these parameters to it. So in any case, I can apply subscription streams here, or IPTF streams, and give it a value of 8, 4, whatever. There's a really good knowledge base article on Microsoft's site where you can change your subscription streams, and they did some testing on various values to help you figure out what might be optimal for your environment. What happens if you run into an error? And so let's say you've got rows that were delivered to a table, and you had foreign key dependencies, and the foreign key was the key back in the table where you have the foreign key dependency wasn't present yet because it hadn't been replicated yet. Then the distribution agent would basically roll back and drop down to a single subscription stream and deliver the commands in the right order. And then once it was past that point, it would throttle back up to the number of subscription streams that you have specified. So subscription streams is another nice knob that you can turn there to get things running faster. Okay. I know we've got just a couple minutes left. I was hoping to get to some demos of showing you a failure. I think I'm going to run out of time, unfortunately, so I'll go through the rest of the knobs that you can tune here. I will include some demo scripts for actually fixing failures. some additional troubleshooting stuff, some advanced stuff, and of course I'll cover that in my summit session as well. I did want to make one more point about the distribution database, and that is, I said earlier, treat it like it's a user database. It shows up under system databases in Management Studio, and I think that's actually bad because you tend to forget about it. You notice it's right here in system databases, but replication being so I/O intensive, you don't want to make the mistake of putting your distribution database on your C drive, for example. You're probably looking at where I've got my database file configured here and realize that's probably a no-no unless your C drive happens to be a solid-state drive and or you've got it configured something special. But follow all the same best practices that you would with a user database for your distribution database, meaning multiple data files if you've got separate physical drives that you can spread out the I/O across. Make sure that you separate your log files and your database or your data files. Make sure that you pre-size your data files. Make sure that you change everything about auto growth. Make sure auto shrink, for whatever reason, doesn't get turned on. And there are a few other things that you can change about your distribution database. We've already hit on this. Your things like your history retention. So you want to make sure that you can bump that up if you want to. All right, I think we are probably at the time mark, so I'm going to have to stop here. And what kind of questions do we have so far?
Okay, we've got a bunch of good questions here for you. We'll try to roll through these. Is there a performance difference between replicating the execution of a stored proc or replicating the execution of a serialized transaction of a stored proc?
Good question. So remember that transactional replication honors transactional boundaries. So the execution of your stored procedure is still going to be within the context of a transaction, meaning if something inside of that fails, it's still going to roll back. You might have, and I'm thinking of the simple scenario where you just have an update statement inside your stored procedure, but you might have something more complex, like something that updates 3 or 4 different tables. So that's why it's important to remember that transactional replication honors transactional boundaries. So the performance difference for me in talking about replicating the execution of stored procedures versus serialized statements is that SQL Server works a lot better with set-based statements than it does with individual singleton statements. So if you're going to change 500,000 rows, would you rather change 500,000 rows in a single update statement, or would you rather change 500,000 rows in 500,000 individual update statements? I think I know what my answer would be.
Exactly. Okay, I've got another one here. Is it possible to sync a subscriber that is way out of sync by generating only the missing rows and not the whole snapshot?
Oh, interesting question. I have not ever seen that done before. That'd be a neat trick if you could.
That would be cool. Another one, can you initialize with backup from the GUI?
No, I have never seen initialize with backup from the GUI. It's all done through scripting. Microsoft has a great knowledge base article on it, and I'll take advantage of the opportunity also to point out that there are some really great books that demonstrate this stuff too. There's a really good ebook from Redgate that Sebastian Main wrote that highlights a lot of this stuff. And also the RepleTalk blog from MSDN has some really good clear-cut examples where they've got screenshots and scripts and stuff like that that show you how to do some of those more advanced things that the GUI doesn't let you do.
Okay, let's see. If you modify an article property to execution of a stored proc, will that generate a new snapshot?
Ooh, really good question. It depends on how you have your replication configured under the covers. Generally, yeah. Generally speaking, when you modify anything about a publication, it's going to cause a new snapshot to get generated. And depending on how your subscribers were initially subscribed, that synchronization model, then that could mean you could get a nasty surprise in the middle of the day. You change the article properties, and all of a sudden your subscriber gets resynced. So be careful with that. I would generally, when I make any kind of changes to replication, I go ahead and I stop all agents from every end, from log reader to distribution agent, and make my changes. You could actually unsubscribe from a publication if you can guarantee that there's no data changes taking place at the publisher, you could actually unsubscribe from a publication and then resubscribe without resynchronizing, and then that would essentially assume that you have everything that you need downstream at your subscriber and start delivering changes again as such. So you'd want to make sure that that stored procedure that you were replicating the execution of actually exists at your subscriber.
Okay. Let's see, and that's a good follow-up to this question. Can the sync with backup option be turned on or off on the fly at either the distributor or the publisher?
Yes, you can turn sync with backup on and off on the fly. You will not cause any resynchronization issues. It takes effect immediately, but you don't have to stop and restart anything.
Sweet. Okay. When the replication reads a transaction log, does it translate the commands in the transaction down to T-SQL? So the follow-up is replication sends the changed pages, correct?
No, actually, what's happening under the covers with transactional replication is you're not sending the pages themselves that have changed. You're actually replicating commands. So I think the answer to the question there would be yes. It's translating an update statement, for example, into a T-SQL statement that gets written into the distribution database and then delivered as a T-SQL statement to the subscriber. If you look back, actually, I'll show you. If you look back at the properties of an article, for example, let's just take a quick look at this table, and you see under statement delivery, it's actually calling a stored procedure that's created system stored procedures that get generated when you create your publications. So SQL Server is turning an update statement, for example, into execute SP UPD something table name and then the values of the columns that have changed and the primary key value. So it tries to be at least efficient about it. It doesn't deliver, let's say you have 30 columns on your table, only one of them changes. It doesn't deliver all 30 columns in the update statement. That would kind of be silly, but it delivers enough as a stored procedure call. It delivers enough to know what to change downstream of the subscriber. But the important distinction there is it's not like database mirroring where you're or always on availability groups where you're actually delivering changed pages. You're delivering T-SQL statements. Okay.
And we have a rephrase of a previous question. If you enable the execution of stored procs here, will that trigger the generation of a new snapshot and reinitialize the subscriptions?
I think that goes back to what I answered before. It depends on how you have your subscriptions set up. There are some scenarios where you can make a change and defer generating the snapshot, and the problem with that is the subscription might not get that change. But the default scenario, and this is where I would caution you, anytime you make a change to replication, is assume that yes, you're going to cause reinitialization to occur, especially if you go through the GUI. It's kind of written to be a little bit of everything, but still kind of simplistic at that. So just assume yes, that anytime you make a change to any kind of publication, that you're going to cause a snapshot agent to run, and your subscriptions may get reinitialized as a result of that.
Okay, one last question. Is there a gain in performance spreading articles into multiple publications?
Yeah, interesting question. So if you think about it from the standpoint of the log reader agent still has to do the same amount of work no matter what. So really what it comes down to is are you mixing tables that have a high volume of change with tables that don't have a very high volume of change? And so remember that transactional replication honors transactional boundaries. If I've got the same tables being delivered downstream to a subscriber, and you're talking about do I break that into two publications or just keep it as one? I'd say just keep it as one, because your boundaries and the order that transactions take place in are going to be honored anyways. If you have a scenario where you say I've got a publication where I've got 5 tables and subscriber A only needs 3 of those tables and subscriber B needs all 5 of those tables, and those 3 tables you're talking about are not very high volume rate of change, then yeah, in that scenario it would make sense to create separate publications One, you're just not delivering excess data downstream to your subscriber that doesn't need it, but also you're just making a logical distinction at that point. But at the end of the day, you still have to do the same amount of work. The log reader agent still has to read through the log. The distribution agent still has to deliver the commands.
Okay, excellent. Can you show your contact info on the screen?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
So let's go back to this. And there you go. Perfect.
Perfect. So that was jam-packed full of info. We did record this. It will be posted here pretty soon. I know I'm going to have to go watch it a couple of times. So thank you very much for presenting today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. And as jam-packed as that was, I've got a bunch more. So if you make it out to the summit and you want to see the rest, I'd love to see you out in my session.
Awesome. And I cannot urge everybody here enough to go to the summit because it is my #1 conference of the year. I love every second of it. So make plans to attend if you haven't already. And I will see you all next month, same place, same time.